So I had a question that is about this idea of ancestry, which, as somebody who helps other people find their roots and figure out their ancestry, who, for both of you, Professor Soyinka, perhaps first, who do you see as your ancestor? Who do you see as the person that you see yourself following in the footsteps of?
I have a feeling that it's an amalgam of a composite of many individuals, personalities, so on. And my mind went almost immediately to an uncle of mine, whose biography, in fact, I was going to write before he died on me. He represented he was a force, a traditional force, and yet he was quite sophisticated as a Western educated person. He combined in the most astonishing way, shall we say, the best of tradition, whether the arts, whether ceremonials, human relationships, the sense of community, and so on and so forth. And he was the principal of a school I first attended before I went to government college, what you call the high school. I began high school somewhere, finished somewhere else. And you all actually know him indirectly because he was uncle to Fela. He was father to Fela, and I was my uncle. And he was a disciplinarian. The 2 years I was there, I was happy to get out of that school. He beat the living shit out of me. And it was both as principal of that college and as my uncle, he had double right to beat me. And I think he didn't lack for cause in those 2 years. But I loved him. I admired him a lot. He was musical, and he was also fierce, a fierce anti-colonial. He and his wife, Bere, Mrs. Ransom Kuti, his wife led the women in their rebellion against a feudal tyrant, the Alake of Abeokuta. I acted as courier among the... So I admired the two of them. But he fascinated me a lot more because there was just something so... He was dynamo in itself, and yet he could be very gentle. And he had a remarkable sense of justice. And his notion of justice was this. If you were accused of anything, he created a court, and you had to defend yourself. Even if he was convinced, if he had seen that student actually stealing or beating up a junior people, if that individual, that criminal, could argue successfully and convince him, he freed him. It didn't matter if he caught, as he did very often, because he also had a poultry, as he caught some of the senior boys stealing his chicken, and so on and so forth. And he said, all right, what happened there? If you made a good case, he acquitted and discharged you, and that was it.
Wow.
He was a very strange person. And I admired him a lot. He was just weird. And unfortunately, he died. But because he died, and I wanted to capture that whole atmosphere, I wrote Ake, The Years of Childhood.
Yeah.
He was the inspiration for that book.
Oh, that's
because
great.
I just missed the opportunity of narrating my background through him. So I just stuck to the background, and that was Ake, Years of Childhood. So I consider him a real ancestor.
So what were you doing to cause this good man to beat you?
All right. Let me tell you how ridiculous the man could be.
I want those.
The man had a notion of, person was into horticulture, nature, and so on. I take after him in that respect. And the football field, or any lawn at all, must be kept green. But not merely kept green. It had to be populated by what you called good grass. There was good grass, not marijuana.
No.
and bad grass. And we as school pupils, we had our portions of those lawns and those fields, which we were supposed to keep clean, green, and without bad grass. But I found the distinction so ludicrous. And I would even sometimes attempt to hide the good bad grass unlep. And his eyes were so sharp and would home in. I mean, we had several students, over 100 students with their own patches of lawn. He would come to mine. And then, what is that? So, just things like that.
You deserve to be beaten.
Ah, come on. Good grass, bad grass. Go ahead. That's the grass.
He's a character. That's great. And so he was fellow Ransom Cootie's father. That's amazing.
Yeah, that's right. And I love just rambling around the woods, just next to the school, when I was supposed to be plucking the bad grass.
So fellow was your first cousin.
Yeah, that's my
Fellow was
first
your
cousin.
first. What about that for good genes, huh? Yeah.
And I gave him his first turn on a stage, because when I had my Knighted British at the Royal Court Theatre in London, and I had a night of poetry, I invited Fela to come and play the saxophone.
Oh, wow.
A compliment to my poetry.
Wow, that's
and that
great.
was his first appearance on stage.
Did he give you royalties subsequently for launching his career?
Well,
No.
British theatre.
What about you, Professor Gates? Who do you see?
It took me a lot of years to realize, but my first image of a writer was right under my nose, my own household. It was my mother. I always already said that my father was a fabulous storyteller, and he was. But my mother, 1957, the schools where I grew up is halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C., in eastern West Virginia, on the Potomac River in the Allegheny Mountains. And it turns out, now that genealogists have, I'm the most genealogically studied black man in the history of the world, and most DNA tested. Turns out my family on both sides, my mother's side and father's side, have lived in the Potomac Valley in the Allegheny Mountains for 200 years. My family never moved. I'm a Redman on my mother's side, and I'm a Redman on my father's side. So there are a handful of black people there in West Virginia, period, but most of the black people live in the coal fields in the southern part of the state. And this is near Harper's Ferry. And you all know about Harper's Ferry because of John Brown. And so Brown v. Board's 1954. Schools integrated in my county in 1955 without Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King or anything. So I went to the white school starting in 1956. In 1957, my mother was elected as the first colored secretary of the Piedmont PTA. And that was a big deal. And every month, all the black people in town, mostly the women, would get all dressed up like it was Sunday, like going to church, and they would go and watch my beautiful mother read the minutes from the previous PTA meeting. And I would be there, I'd have my little white shirt, my little tie on, and I'd look up at this goddess, reading. And not only did she become the first colored secretary of the PTA, representing the race, of course, she would write the obituaries for all the black people in the Potomac Valley when they died. The newspaper would call, say, so-and-so died, and she would write their obituary. And she would read that obituary as a eulogy in church. And I would, before I started school, I would go to all these funerals with my mother. And if Daddy was off from work, he would go. And I remember one time, and she would just, my mother had the capacity to name the person that you wanted to be in your heart before the world had prevented you from becoming that person. She knew how to sense a person off. And I remember we were walking home. I was just a little kid, and I was holding my parents' hands, and we were coming back from the church. And my father, she called him Gates, and her name was Pauline. And Daddy said, Pauline, you did a good job. You did a good job today. And she said, really, Gates? And he said, yeah. He said, at one point, he said, I started to stand up, open the casket to see if that son of a bitch was still in the... And I laughed, and she laughed, and that was like getting A+ on her eulogy. And it took me years to realize that, in part, the compulsion I have for genealogy came from my mother doing people's obituaries. That was the first glimpse, you know, assessing a life and doing a biography. And in fact, I did my first family tree. I know the day I did my first family tree. It was July 3rd, 1960, because it was the day after we buried Edward St. Lawrence Gates, who was my grandfather, Pop Gates. And my father took my brother and me up to look at his, up to the open casket. It was the first time I was that close to a corpse, which was terrifying to me. And then we went over we buried him. And my grandfather looked white. I mean, he could have passed for white. And I remember standing there at the casket thinking how absurd he looked, because he looked like, we called him Casper behind his back. He was so white. So you can imagine, if he looked like a ghost with blood coursing through his veins, you can imagine how white he looked dead. He looked like he had been coated with alabaster and sprinkled with baby powder. And I just thought he looked ridiculous. And I'm standing there holding my father's hand, looking at him, and I heard this noise from my father, and I thought my father was laughing at how ridiculously white his father looked. And I started to laugh too, and I looked up, and the noise I heard, my father was crying. So I thought my life had ended, that this was the most embarrassing thing that I ever could do, laughing at the open casket of my grandfather. But fortunately, I was, you know, a little kid. Nobody even noticed me. So when I started to cry, right? So it was very traumatic. And after we buried my father, we came back to the Gates family home. And my father took my brother and me upstairs to his parents' bedroom. And we still own that house. My cousin Johnny Gates owns that house. And there's a sun porch off the bedroom. And he took my brother and me out on the sun porch. And there was an armoire there, and he opened it up, and it was full of bank ledgers, because my grandfather was a janitor at the First National Bank in Cumberland. And it turns out he was stealing these bank ledgers and using them as scrapbooks. No. And my father was looking furiously for something in one of these scrapbooks. So he took out 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these bank ledgers, and he's on the floor, and he's turning the pages. And finally, he finds what he's looking for. And he said that you boys look. And we looked over his shoulder, and it was an obituary dated January 6, 1888. And it said, died this day in Cumberland, Maryland, Jane Gates, an estimable colored woman. And then he pulled a picture of her out between the leaves of this scrapbook. It was a sepia photograph. She was a slave, he said, till slavery was abolished in Maryland in 1864. And she was a midwife, and she was in her midwifery costume. And he said, she's the oldest Gates we've ever recorded. I never want you to forget her name, and I never want you to forget her face. And my brother and me, my brother and I looked at each other, and that's all my father said. And then he put the scrapbooks, closed the scrapbook, and put all the 6 bank ledgers back in the armoire. We went downstairs, had the repast, and we drove home 25 miles away. And the last thing I did before I went to bed, because I had read Webster's dictionary, and that obituary, remember, had said, died this day in Cumberland, Maryland, Jane Gates, an estimable colored woman. And the last thing I did before I went to bed was look up the word estimable, because I didn't know what it meant. And the next day, after the colored picnic, because it was right on the eve of the 4th of July, on the way home, I asked my father if he'd buy me a composition book. And we stopped at Red Bull's newsstand, and he bought me a composition book. And that night, in front of our little 12-inch black and white TV, I did my first family tree. Wow. I interviewed my parents because I wanted to know how someone who looked like me with my phenotype could have, as a grandfather, a man who looked so white, we called him Casper behind his back, And then how he could be the grandson of a woman who clearly looked African, of African descent, who was this funny-looking person who was something called a midway. And I was able to go back to my great-great-grandparents on my mother's side, and on my father's side to Jane Gates. And Jane Gates' children were fathered by a white man. And she only told her children that they all had the same father, but she never identified, and never revealed his identity. She took the secret of his identity to the grave. And now, a genetic genealogist, purely using DNA, a brilliant woman named C.C. Moore, has found the identity of my great-great-grandfather, and we're revealing it next season in Finding Your Roots.
Oh my God. Nice. That was a nice wind-up.